everyone. I am Dr. Joy Lawson Davis, and I'm so excited to join you for this presentation for the Dabrowski Congress. I'm particularly excited because this is my first presentation for this Congress, for this conference, and to be a part of this is very special to me in my career and the work that I'm attempting to do to draw attention to the needs of culturally diverse learners who are gifted and share some of the same traits as other gifted learners. I've been thinking about this idea of overexcitabilities through the lens of culturally diverse learners for a long time. And so I have some ideas here that I'm put together that I want to share with you, but I would like to ask you to consider my ideas and how they may impact the work that you do or the work that others may do. And if you have any additional suggestions for me, I would certainly love to hear them. If you'd like to join me in further exploring this topic and perhaps writing about it, just please let me know. I'll share with you my contact information in the last slide before we begin Q&A, but I want to please invite you to share with me as much as you can, as much as you choose to, as we have our Q&A session at the end of the presentation. Thank you so much again for joining me. I appreciate that. So the session overview is simple. We're going to look at the overexcitabilities. We're going to be examining just a few of the overexcitabilities, and I'll share with you why in just a moment, and talk about giftedness and how the question I think for us is, how can understanding OEs help us recognize giftedness in culturally diverse learners? That's what I like to pose to the audience, to the field, to classroom teachers, to advocates, to families of these learners, and helping them as well understand what overexcitabilities are and what that means to these gifted learners whose manifestations of giftedness come across in many, many different ways. They are more intense, they are more excitable, they are more sensitive. Not all of them have the same traits. That's something else that we have to think about, but they do. Many of them carry these traits and into their work, into their lives, and not just as children, but also as adult gifted learners, gifted individuals. I've recently become involved with a few groups of persons who are having conversations about being adults and being gifted, being adult and having twice exceptional conditions or thrice exceptional conditions. And some of the conversations are quite lively and, again, very, very intense. I've come across people from around the world, and I've made some new friends, some new colleagues. I'm excited about the idea of having more conversations with individuals who share traits, and in many ways have had challenges because they happen to be gifted, or challenges because they happen to be twice exceptional or thrice exceptional, or challenges for the families, especially in getting their students identified. And if they attend public schools, particularly having problems with highly gifted students receiving appropriate services, highly gifted Black students, how Black boys are continuously being portrayed as aberrant rather than as being excitable, intelligent, brilliant individuals. So this field continues to excite me, continues to have me thinking about what I can do as a strategist, as an advocate, as a scholar, as a faculty member, as I teach others about giftedness in different populations. So I'd like for us to think about how culturally diverse students demonstrate traits that are often overlooked by educators that may also be indicative of giftedness. So the traits that I'm referring to, primarily those overexcitability traits that they have, that may also be characteristic of a person who's gifted. Now, I do recognize that there's controversy in the field among scholars around whether or not, because a person has OEs, does that mean that they're gifted, or vice versa. I'm on the side of individuals who believe that overexcitabilities absolutely, absolutely do characterize the lived experiences of gifted learners. Those people who are more intense, those students who are more sensitive. I've lived with them. I raised three gifted individuals. All three of my children were identified as gifted early on. I've taught in schools. I've been a director in a school for high school gifted students from diverse populations who were artists and techies. I've done the work. I've been a grants coordinator, so I've seen and I've worked with individuals across populations, and I've seen giftedness in the many, many ways that it shows up. And I know from my own experiences that there are these students and their talent lies in every community. And so it's incumbent upon us as advocates, as scholars, to find these students and to use every tool at our disposal. And one of the tools I think that we can make better use of are the OE characteristics or the traits, the checklist of OE individuals. So, my introduction to Dabrowski and OEs. I first became familiar with Dabrowski's theory of positive disintegration and the overexcitabilities through my graduate studies at the College of William and Mary many years ago, many eons ago. As a grad student, one of my favorite courses, one of the courses that really struck a chord in me and resonated with me was the social emotional needs course. The identification course, of course, that also, helped me to become more familiar with strategies, more familiar with the theorists over time, all the challenges, all of the work that had been done, all the testing, everything. But when we became involved in discussing social emotional needs, I came upon for the first time in my career the work of Dr. Michael Pichowski. I believed in my work that OEs were important to understand for all gifted students, but particularly, and I came upon this understanding very early, but particularly for culturally diverse gifted students, because once again, even prior to my grad studies, I had been engaged with students and families in many different contexts. And one time, as my children were growing and having concerns because they were gifted, I took it upon myself. I was very curious about Dr. Pichowski. I read his books. I read most of the work or the articles, and I analyzed the articles for my coursework. I did all kinds of things to get to know him better. And at one point, I was having some challenges with my son who was entering high school. And as a very compassionate, highly empathetic, he was a writer. He eventually became a leader in his school. But when he first started high school, he would come home regularly and talk about feeling out of place. And one of the reasons he felt like he was out of place was because he felt that he was different as a boy, being more respectful of the teachers, perhaps, simple things like picking up trash that students have thrown in the floor or opening the door for the teachers as they were going out, or for females in general, just doing things that he had been raised to do and just felt comfortable that it was the right thing to do. And then also feeling in his heart that there were things happening that really bothered him. He didn't know how to respond. So anyway, I wrote to Dr. Pichowski about Brandon, about him, and I wrote maybe a 2-page letter at the time. And within a couple of months, I received a letter back from Mike Pichowski. I was stunned that he would take the time to write me back. Actually wrote the letter back, and not in an email, but in a hard copy of the letter, and wrote back to me about my son. And it felt so comfortable. It felt so good that someone of his status, of his scholarship, someone of his experience felt that he cared so much about my child, about what my child was going through. And he gave me a few strategies. First of all, he talked about how he understood how the kind of a person that Brandon probably was without having met him, but just based on my description. And then also he gave me a few strategies that I could use to help him to understand others better, but also to accept himself as the compassionate, empathetic person that he is. And I say is because he's still that kind of a young man today, a father today, and is raising his children to be quite the same. But it was a good experience for me, and it really helped draw me into this work a little bit more. Many years later, I had the opportunity, and this is where the picture comes from. I had the opportunity to keynote at my first SANG conference with other keynoters, but Dr. Pichowski was one. He was a keynoter, and after his message, I approached the stage to keynote. And it was just a wonderful experience. Afterwards, we struck up a conversation. He gave me a hug, as you can see when we took pictures, and he was saying to me, "You are a rock star. You are a rock star." And it just made my heart feel so good to receive such a compliment from someone like Dr. Pichowski, with all the great work that he's done in the field to help us better understand the psychosocial development, not just the intellectual development, but the person of the gifted individual. So I want to suggest to us that culturally diverse students also express overexcitabilities. And I know that some of you may have already done some of this work, and you wouldn't deny it. You're not arguing, you're not here to argue with me. You're just here to listen to my feedback on this issue. But I do know, again, that these students express these kinds of overexcitabilities. Teachers have told me about these students using language that aligns with overexcitabilities without even knowing what the OEs are. So that's been quite interesting as well. So what I'm suggesting is that what if we view the OEs through the traits, inclinations, experiences, and observed behaviors of culturally diverse students? What if we did that? So the next three slides after this slide, what I've done is I've taken three of the overexcitabilities and made a comparison between the overexcitabilities and the research work of scholars in the field who have studied the cultural strengths, the cultural traits of Black students. In particular, I'm focusing here on Black students in this particular presentation, on Black students for many, many years. I'm going to share with you the work of Dr. A. Wade Boykin from Howard University, an award-winning psychologist who for many years conducted studies of the traits of gifted students, not necessarily identified as gifted, Black students in the inner city and school districts where he and his colleagues and his graduate assistants worked. And what he was able to do was he was able to develop a listing of particular traits that the Black students that he observed and worked with. He spoke with families, he spoke with educators, he observed behaviors of students over a long period of time. He was able to come up with a few traits of Black students that he found to be observable, and also the traits that he believed impacted their academic achievement. So when I read his work and went back to his work many years later, as I was writing my dissertation, I thought, wow, other people in the field, and particularly in gifted education, working with diverse learners, need to know the work of Boykin. And then there's Janice Hale Benson. She was at Johns Hopkins many years ago, and Benson actually wrote a number of books. And one book that she wrote in particular, she constructed, again, a listing of traits of Black students that were aligned with academic achievement, or in many ways the academic achievement gap between Black students and white students, and how teachers could teach to those traits to raise student achievement. So I wanted to share that with you. You know already about the work of Dr. Donna Ford, a prolific gifted education scholar for many, many years, who's done great work and a lot of research studies, a great number of books she's written about culturally diverse learners and their gifted traits and the gaps and the challenges around having them identified. So those individuals, Boykin, Benson, Ford, and I also want to point to the work of Jody Lakin and Jonathan Way, I believe that's how his name is pronounced, around visual spatial learners, and how those individuals also need to be recognized as we go through a process of understanding what giftedness is in students of different cultural groups. So again, I've only chosen for this particular piece three of the overexcitabilities: the emotional overexcitability, the intellectual overexcitability, and the psychomotor overexcitability. And I'll share with you some of my thinking, some of my insights, and then talk a little bit more about specific traits, and then specific individuals whose work and whose lives have characterized the OEs in such a phenomenal way that we really need to be able to utilize the lives of these individuals to help us better understand more culturally diverse gifted learners. So let's start with the emotional OE. So first of all, the description of emotional OE is on the left hand side, and then the traits, inclinations, and observed behaviors of culturally diverse learners is on the right hand side. And what I'm doing is I want us to be able to look at these OEs in a different way and look at them through the research around culturally diverse learners and what we already know about them, and how those two align, how they align quite well. So first of all, the emotional OE is described as extreme of emotion and a positive and negative feelings, complex emotions, identification with others' feelings, or what many times we call hyperempathy, the awareness of a whole range of feelings, the capacity for strong attachments, deep relationships, strong emotional ties and attachments to persons, living things, places, animals. And sometimes, as a result of these emotional OEs, individuals have a difficulty adjusting to new environments. We also know them as compassionate, being very responsive, and sensitivity in relationships. And also, they express deeply how it feels to be lonely. And of course, we know about the overexcitability checklist. We know other tools that are being utilized to help families and educators, rate their students on their OEs, and and how they do express them. So, but culturally diverse learners, they also demonstrate, they also indicate in their behaviors emotional OEs, emotional overexcitability. They have early social consciousness. They do express empathy. They're very concerned about family and community. As a matter of fact, in social science research, the Black family is considered a communal society, as are families in the Latino and Hispanic cultures. We also, in our research around Black students, we talk about the blessing and burdens of race, of what race means to individuals, and particularly those, once again, who are very intense and very empathetic, and are experiencing challenges because of their race in schools. They do have conflicted feelings oftentimes. These students are being Black and being gifted, called an Oreo. You know what that means: Black on the outside, white on the inside, and not being accepted. And that oftentimes causes great trauma for them. They express physical response to loneliness, being different, not included, or disincluded. They have strong attachments to non family members, neighbors, in some cases, even gang members, club or sorority, fraternity members who support them. They also are very deeply concerned about nature and the environment. About 2 years ago, I came in contact with a gifted adult learner who was working on her dissertation, and she and a few other colleagues have a group called our Wild Minds, and I can share that connection with you, a link about Our Wild Minds. But this young woman is an environmentalist by her scholarship, but she's also highly gifted, and she wants people to understand what it means to be a Black female in that field, and be so gifted, and the challenges that she has come across, but also the groups and the community that she's been able to gather around her to help her feel better about who she is and the work that she's doing, and how she can contribute to the field. A. Wade Boykin, in his work, and I put this at the bottom, these four characteristics were some of the characteristics that he developed in his research, that Black students expressed a high level of spirituality, affect, harmony, and as I mentioned earlier, communalism. Communalism. I have stories in my Bright, Talented, and Black, the second edition, actually in first edition and second edition, that were written by the family members and individuals themselves, gifted individuals themselves, that talk about their emotional OEs, the challenges and the conflicts they've had being highly gifted and being Black, and what they face in the public school environment in particular. And many of these families have been driven into utilizing the homeschooling mechanism to teach their students, because they don't trust the private school environment, nor do they trust the public school environment. But I would recommend, if you haven't seen Bright, Talented, and Black, the second edition, there's an entire section in there on highly gifted, and some of their stories are included there. So let's go to another overexcitability. I want to go to psychomotor. Now, many people, of course, almost immediately, some of you, as you know what OE, the psychomotor OE is, you will immediately be drawn to the fact that the psychomotor OE describes athletes, especially high-ranking athletes. These people have a surplus of energy. They have intense physical activity. They love sports. They have a pressure for action. They're very impulsive many times, and sometimes there's a marked competitiveness in them. And of course, this is the general definition of psychomotor. Easily, we can take the psychomotor definition and look at it through a culturally diverse learners lens. And here we have verve, athleticism. These students are often accused of moving around the classroom to the teacher's chagrin. Teachers don't like, particularly young students in elementary school, primary school, and particularly they characterize boys as being aberrant because they like to move around the classroom. I'd like to be able to remove that trait or that phrase from my list at some point, but I still hear it from families that one of the reasons why the child's teacher of a highly gifted, particularly Black boys, are being sent to the office, they're being recommended for special education evaluation, many times misdiagnosed as ADHD or behavior disorder, because they want to move. They want to get up and move around the classroom. These students also have exemplary oratorial skills, because they do like to talk. They do like to argue. And so they're very good at debate. And so when you find in schools that serve a predominant population of Black students, if they have a debate team, their debate team will probably be a very highly regarded debate team. Just recently, we heard about students from New Orleans on a debate team who won a national championship, Black students who won a national championship. And they competed against very high-ranking students in private schools, predominantly white schools, and they won. Their intellectual skills as well as their oratorical skills combined enabled them to be excellent debaters. These individuals sometimes will become exceptional dancers in all genres, from ballet to hip hop. These students are accused by teachers, and many of you may have had the same accusation. I know I did. I have my report cards from elementary school, and my mom gave them to me so I could keep them among my own archives. And one year, I had a teacher who repeatedly said that Joy talks too much. Joy talks too much. And if I could see that teacher today, I know that was many, many years ago, but my talking too much has enabled me and empowered me over the years in the great work that I do. Sometimes these students are called a little too competitive, but once again, if they're competitive, it's because they believe in themselves and they believe they have the skill set to win, and they will work hard. They will work hard at winning. Sometimes to their own detriment, they don't accept losing as well. And so, of course, any student that has in any domain have a view that they are the best and they can be the best all the time, will need to have some support from parents and family members and educators and advocates to help them understand that failure helps us, that failure is good for us. And being too competitive and being judgmental of others can oftentimes cause problems that are unnecessary. But anyway, I think you see, I hope you see that in the work that we have around the trace, what students are inclined to do and the observed behaviors, we see psychomotor overexcitabilities. And this is just a very brief list. And again, here we're going to go back to Boykin's work. These are some traits that Boykin found in his work. Ironically, he found that these students were athletic. They expressed verve. Verve is movement, dancing, excitability. And they also had oral strengths that when he spoke to and he observed these students in the classroom across grade levels and different environments, spoke to family members, and of course engaged with teachers to find out more about who these students were that they were observing and researching over a period of time. And then finally, I have one more, and then I want to kind of pull some of this together and talk about individuals. But the intellectual OE, this one is probably the easier one to make an alignment with culturally diverse learners, even though we might believe the psychomotor one is, but I believe that the intellectual OE. The intellectual OE, these individuals are curious, they have the capacity for sustained intellectual effort or expressing what we know of in the research as flow, being able to stay and stick to a topic and to some work until they're able to gain the progress and the success that they want to. They are able to concentrate. They are avid readers. They are keen observers. So when we speak to these young people, they don't miss details. They have a quick recall and detailed visual recall, that they can remember details and remember ideas, remember conversations. That's one of the reasons why they excel in the classroom, is because their memories are so acute. They have a passion for precision, for things being perfect or being precise. And so they can give that information back to you. I actually observed a young gifted boy online the other day, and his mother said that he's very much into space and into the planets, and he's read a lot on his own, and he actually was writing down the names of planets and asteroids and the speed, and it was just amazing to see what this kid had remembered from what he had seen and what he had read about, what he read about and saw in online, in environments, educational environments. 5 years old, 5 years old. But the detail and the preciseness of his lists. He had 3 lists that he was working on, and on 3 large boards, smart boards, and it was just amazing to see this little character writing and having this understanding and the recall that he had. These students ask probing questions and are good at problem solving. They search for the truth and understanding. They're very good at forming new concepts. They are tenacious in problem solving. They love theory and analysis. Sometimes they can be preoccupied with logic and introspection. Now, with the culturally diverse learners, these are some of the traits that have been observed and have been written about. They are avid readers. They have an interest in domains oftentimes different from their peers. They have excellent recall. Organizational and analytical strengths are very well developed. They have very strong visual spatialization skills. And I'm so grateful for the work of Joni Lakin and Jonathan Way to kind of put that information out there so that people will understand that is an entire group of students that we are missing out on helping them to develop those skills. Who will they become? As adults, as adult producers in our society, they will become architects, designers. They will become the individuals behind the technology that we have available to us, artificial intelligence. They have traits and skills that we're overlooking and we're denying in many cases. They're independent thinkers. They're very observant of contradictions. They also, and this is what may get them into some difficulty in school, they often they question authority, teachers, parents, other adults, particularly when the authoritarian figure says things that don't make any sense. And many times we don't watch ourselves, we find ourselves in that position as educators, or we say things that may be contradictory or hypocritical. These students will call you out on that. And many times in the classroom, if a Black student does that, they may get into disciplinary trouble, whereas a student who is white may be seen as a bright student. These are the challenges that we are still addressing in our field. These students also have excellent storytelling skills. You remember about the oratory, it transfers over. They're very good at storytelling. They have a strong visual memory. They're bullied sometimes for being different from their peers. I have a piece that I wrote some years ago about a young student, a boy who was an excellent athlete and was told by his peers that were going with him to the governor's school for academically gifted students that he was too Black to be gifted. And so he was bullied on a regular basis, and he shared that with his mother, and his mother was able to intervene. And he also, by his peers, his athletic peers, who were living in his community, were on the football team, he thought they were his friends, they said he was not Black enough. And so these students being identified as gifted is not always the prize or the treasure that many people believe it to be. Sometimes Black students, students of color, students who are different than other peers in terms of their gender, in terms of their neighborhood, their ethnicity, do find themselves on the worst end of being bullied. These students also have a tendency to have a vocabulary that's more sophisticated, more elaborate than their peers. Many of them began reading earlier, and because of that, they developed a more sophisticated vocabulary. So, intellectual OEs, psychomotor OEs, emotional OEs. Consider those three categories and consider how we might be able to utilize the OE understandings that we have to do a better job of identifying students, but also supporting them, providing the resources and support that they need. Janice Hill Benson, that I mentioned to you earlier, gave these 4 traits of African American learners. She said they were social and affective, people oriented. Think about the social emotional needs of these students, and the emotional OE. Harmonious, the interdependent, and that is respected and encouraged. Knowledge is sought for practical and relevant purposes. So one of the things that we do understand is when we're working with culturally diverse learners and we do problem solving with them, one of the things we want to make sure of is that the problems are relevant problems, practical problems, so that they can engage and they can relate to those problems. These students express a high level of creativity. They're adaptive. They're very stylistic. They are intuitive. And again, just like Dr. Boykin discovered, their oral expression is quite different than some other students in their groups. Their nonverbal communication is very important to them. Movement and rhythm, just as Dr. Boykin said, verve are vital to these learners. So I just want to share with you, for my sake, that this turned out a little differently, but I just wanted to show you the kinds of people that we're talking about from different cultural groups who are problem solvers, visual spatial learners, champs at chess games, very avid learners, avid readers, dancers. This young lady here and this young lady, both of them are climate activists in their communities. This person here is a climate activist as well in New York City. Hope you recognize this painting, this very, very, very expensive painting by Basquiat. Basquiat was a young Black man. Actually, he's transitioned now, but his art was compared to some of the great masters. And for a short period of time, he did produce some of the greatest artwork in the world, and he's an African American male. Just a few visuals of who these students are, these individuals are, who may also have OE traits that can be easily recognizable if we are seeking them in that way, looking at them. I wanted to point out to you, and I don't have as much time as I like to. We need to do a whole presentation on Octavia Butler. But if there was ever an intense, compassionate, problem solving genius in the field of literary arts, it would be Octavia Butler, the first African American female science fiction writer who also was a MacArthur Fellow, one of the MacArthur geniuses. What has been uncovered are a number of Octavia's notebooks where she wrote about who she's going to be when she is finished with her work. You know, I'm a writer, I write, and she talks about in her notebooks her self-reflective thoughts that she was going to be an award-winning writer, and all the time Octavia was also dyslexic. So in my work about 3E individuals, she's one that I always point out and I always speak to. I'm actually reading or rereading one of her books at this moment. And I'm just fascinated. I have to take my time through it because she thoroughly fascinates me with her capacity to tell the future. What she spoke about in her writings are things that are actually occurring today in our society around the world. But again, we don't want to discount the traits and the individual experiences of people of color, culturally diverse learners who are in so many ways overexcitable. They do express the same kinds of traits, those traits that Mike Wachowski spoke about in his book. I love that book. I read it twice, and is one of my go-to books. And so these recommendations I put before you, and again, I'm just starting on this and hope I can come up with something relevant and useful. I'm working on a characteristics listing that perhaps classroom teachers can utilize, and maybe some modifications to the OE checklist, the OE test. But I do want to put this before you and ask that you join me if you're interested in the culturally diverse gifted learner who you recognize because you work with them or you're interested in this, who do have OE characteristics and traits. And I'm not suggesting that the work that's been done in the past did not cover cultural diversity, but what I'm saying is that we have to be intentional. So these are my recommendations. Number one, I think classroom teachers can use an OE description chart as an observation list for talent spotting. That's one of my recommendations and one of my thoughts about this. I think that all educators should receive training in what OEs are. And when I say all, I'm not just talking about educators of the gifted. I'm talking about every educator in every school should have that as a part of their training. I also believe, and I've said this many times in the past few years, that mandated cultural competency training be included in all gifted education coursework. That researchers consider conducting studies of the presence of OE behaviors in culturally diverse students, particularly Black students, Brown students, and those students that we consider thrice exceptional. And that we intentionally view diverse learners with high potential as gifted when OE behaviors are observed. When OE behaviors are observed, we can also put that into our body of understanding about giftedness and utilize it to help us better understand these students, what their experiences are, provide the supports, the social emotional supports that they need, provide the intellectual and academic resources and access to programming that they need to develop and grow, but accept them as gifted learners in the same way that we accept all others as gifted learners. I have a few resources and references that I've added to the slide that I want to share with you. Of course, I share Boykin and Benson. Also, have a link to youth climate activists, about 19 of them that are across cultural groups that you should follow. Of course, I've shared with you my book, the work of Dr. Ford, Lakin and Way, and Dr. Piowski, his Mellow Out book, and then a great article that was written by, actually, it's a chapter in the book by Chris Wells and Mike Piowski on re-examining overexcitability, a framework for understanding intense experience. So I really, again, I just wanted to kind of point these out. I've got a lot more work to do on this, but I am grateful for the opportunity to share my work with you. This is my contact information. You can contact me by email at my Bridges email address. Please join me on X. There's a lot of great conversation going on right now. Some of it's very political, but I also still try to focus on equity and gifted education and share the genius across these communities that we serve. I also have a Facebook page, We Are Gifted Too, that I like to share information, have conversations about giftedness in culturally diverse communities, and get others to join me in the advocacy necessary to help us do a better job of identifying giftedness in all communities. And also understand the intensities, the experiences of gifted learners who have the traits of overexcitabilities. Thank you so much for joining me, and I look forward to having our Q&A in just a few moments.
Great. Thank you, Joy, for sharing.
You're welcome. Thank you.
All right. So now it's time for some questions from our attendees. So I don't see any questions in Slido yet, but if you have a question at this point, you could also raise your hand in Zoom and I can promote you to speak. Or share your questions in the chat and we'll pick them up from there.
And while you're doing that, I'm just going to grab a couple of resources and pop them in the chat. Caitlin Smith from Our Wild Minds was actually on the podcast, so I'll link the podcast episode and I'll try and find a link for Mellow Out as well.
Okay, thank you.
Great. And while we wait for our participants or attendees to share their questions, maybe I can start us off. Thank you, Joy. So one challenge that I heard, in addition to the general challenge of identifying and seeing gifted kids in a learning environment, it seems that for cultural diverse students, there's additional challenges, not least from their own communities, it seems, where I was struck by the Oreo metaphor.
Right.
Also by you're too black to be gifted, these comments.
Right.
And that made me wonder that what policies or interventions would you think, based on what you've learned, would be helpful to address those extra challenges?
Yeah. Well, I think first of all, as a culture and as a community, all communities have to accept the challenges that are present particularly for gifted learners that originate from those communities. In other communities, it may be that gifted kids are called all kinds of other names like nerds, and there's a number of very negative, in my view, very negative language that's being used against gifted students. And then, of course, the bullying that goes on, and particularly with students who express gender, issues, genders in the communities. And so I think, first of all communities have to be better informed. And so wherever there's an opportunity to share the kinds of experiences, the real experiences, the lived experiences that students go through, possibly through a panel discussion, having students themselves sit before a group of families, a group of community members, and tell them, it's always best to hear the real deal, the real story, to tell others what it really means and what they go through. Because oftentimes those who are on the outside of our gifted world, I call it, They think that students who are gifted have everything going for them. It's a prize. It's like they've been anointed or something, and that makes them better than others. But that's not the feeling of those students in the gifted community. It's just not their experience. And so I think it's really important to have students sit before us and tell their stories, and to tell them before large audiences of people who can impact the change that's necessary. I was in California once, in San Mateo, California, at a school, and it was a culturally diverse conference or symposium they held for a couple of days, and I was a speaker and others were speakers. But one of the sessions was a session of students that actually go to that school, the School for the Gifted, and they sat before the audience, the same audience, and told them what it meant to be a gifted learner, what the pros and cons were, what was the upside of it, and then what was the downside. And it was one of the more powerful experiences I've ever had, to actually sit in the audience and listen to those students. Now, of course, I've worked with students and I've had one-on-one, but I think that engagement like that really made a difference to the participants in the audience, because they heard some things that perhaps they would not have heard otherwise, unless it was their own child. They didn't hear it from the perspective of all these different students from different cultural backgrounds, and to hear it all in one time. So that's one of the things that I think has to happen. You have to accept that there are some challenges to these students who are very bright, very intense. They have high potential, but there are also many, many challenges. And what we want to do, and I was stunned actually just recently to hear from a colleague that was interviewing a student for an article that we're writing on thrice exceptional students, and we use this student as a case, and had some particular questions. I was stunned that this student here in 2024 was told by someone that he was an Oreo. It stunned me, because I know that was something that we heard many, many years ago, and I thought that we had come along much further than that. And I was stunned, and I was very hurt for him as well. And so I think again, we need to make sure that everybody understands what these students go through. Not that they're going to agree with us always, of course, but we certainly can put it out there and have them tell their stories. And so as a part of the work I do, I believe in stories. I believe stories, anecdotal stories, are critically important. The research, the hard data research is important too, but I just believe stories are very, very important to tell. And so I think the more we have opportunities to tell stories, the better we'll become as a group of humans, I think, to help each other out. Yeah.
Yeah, great. Thanks for sharing that. Let's see. Are there any questions in the chat?
There is one in Slido.
There's one Slido. Great.
So Anonymous has asked, I love the suggestions for academic institutions. Are there existing practical guides to implement for administrators?
Say that again, dear. Existing practical guide?
Yeah, I love the suggestions for academic institutions. Are there existing practical guides to implement for administrators? So is there anything practical out there insofar as handbooks or guides?
Well, I think that in some research you're going to find recommendations. You'll find it there, but perhaps if you haven't had a chance to take a look at my book, Bright, Talented, and Black, in the second edition, I think that there are some particular guidelines included. They're included there for parents, but they're also included for community and advocates as well. I would really, of course, I'm self-promoting, but I think that, the work that went into Bright, Talented, and Black, the first edition and the second edition, provide, practical story suggestions. And as I mentioned, there's an entire section in the second edition with profiles and updated information around about 4 or 5 highly gifted individuals from around the country that they wrote themselves, or their parent. In one case, a parent wrote. And so that information in those stories, those vignettes, are very, very helpful, as well as others in that book, and a few other books that are out there that I think we need to give a little bit more credit to.
Great, thank you, Joy. There's a comment in the chat from Ineke. She says, "This is not my field, but I work at a school that is particularly not very diverse. But I am a teacher of gifted children, and I find the OEs indeed very helpful for identification, especially in 2E students who are often overlooked because of their behavior. The gifted children in my class are mostly 2E, children that are being misunderstood in the regular class.
Right.
Thank you for this talk, and with that, this focus on diversity."
Thank you. Thank you very much.
I'm going to take a chance to jump in here.
Okay.
I just want to make a bit of a connection between the three players on the screen, because Joy, you talked about cultural competency, and when we had Caitlin Smith on the podcast, we talked about the importance of learning. So trying to learn about someone and their situations, and then unlearning in the moment. So being willing to listen to the person and challenge your biases and preconceived notions. And in positive disintegration, we talk about subject-object. So trying to view someone subjectively, use your empathy and view them as a unique human. And I know, Sergey, you also talk about planning for emergence with CMM and allowing things to unfold and learn in the moment. So I thought that was a really cool connection. So
Excellent.
Joy, did you have anything that you would like to add around cultural competency in particular?
Well, I'm just I have for the last maybe this is probably coming up my 4th year. I'm teaching a course in cultural diversity and twice exceptionality at Bridges. And it has become, I think, one of the more enlightening experiences that I've had as an educator, as a teacher, as a professor, because these are dissertation level, doc students, and most of them prior to this course, haven't had any training, any coursework, read material around cultural competency. And so our conversations are very lively. There's lots of questions. And then there are a lot of times their minds are changed beyond where they were when they started the course. And I think the course has become very popular at Bridges because they're interested. And I think we make a presumption sometimes that individuals who are not already into cultural competency understandings don't have an interest. I think that we need to spread that out as well. That's why I recommend that cultural competency training should be integrated into gifted education training, into any teacher education program. We shouldn't have any teachers anywhere in this nation by now who don't have some level of cultural competency understanding. We're such a diverse nation. We're so diverse, and we continue to become more and more diverse every day. And it's only fair to all the students and the families that, and those persons that we work with, that we have a better understanding of who they are in their communities, who they are in their families, what language concerns they have, what cultural norms they have. It is not fair for us to take our own cultural norms and place them over these people just because this is the way we do things when they come in and they do things very, very differently. It's really incumbent upon us to be more sensitive to the needs of people from other cultural groups, period. And for me, it's an exciting area. I've met people from many places. I've changed my mind about people because I had a chance to interact with them. And it's the scholarly training, but it's also the interaction that's necessary. You have to have time to be with people sometimes. If you can't live with them for a while, at least go and experience the way they do their everyday things, the way they worship, the way they go shopping for their foods, the way they sit down with their children and their families and have conversations, the way they celebrate. So there's so many, and there are many recommendations that I make in my course. And if students have time, I always give them some ideas about how they can actually do some what we call cross-cultural training. And in doing that, they've gone into another culture for a period of time and experienced it, and experienced in other cultures, and then come back and talk about what you've learned and how you feel now, and whether or not you feel like your mind and your heart is open, because I think that's what we have to do. We don't have any choices as the most diverse nation in the world. We really don't have any choices. We never have, because we've always been diverse. But yeah, I really think that cultural competency for all of us is number one. It's critical. It's absolutely vital. Yes.